All right, starting with chapter 1. This chapter is just a brief overview of language, the definition of language, and language disorders. Each time I give a lecture, I go ahead and just review the goals that are stated in your textbook. But I think they're important because as you are self evaluating and self monitoring what you're getting out of this course, I agree with these goals they've identified because it might be a lot of information, but if you're going to take something away, if you want to make sure you know the key parts of the content that we'd like you to take, it's those chapter goals. So for this chapter, it's to differentiate between speech, language, and communication, to explain the characteristics of language, and to identify characteristics of language disorder. Again, these key terms are always going to be listed, but as you're studying, you could come back to these and make sure you have a grip on these definitions. All right, we're going to start with a case study. And this case study is for Kevin. I like that the book has case studies listed because I personally feel like I learn most through case studies. And so we're going to do several of these throughout the semester. Kevin is a 9-year-old student in a regular 4th grade classroom. Kevin seems bright and usually works hard, but he is a puzzle to his teacher. Sometimes it seems as though he's just not all there. He misunderstands directions, failing to complete all of the assignment or even working on the wrong pages. He is reluctant to answer questions in class. When he does answer, he stops and starts and seems confused. Kevin is a slow, hesitant reader. His teacher, Mrs. Ross, has noticed that his comprehension of text often seems to be ahead of his ability to read the words themselves. He is a poor speller. In his writing, he tends to use short, choppy sentences, and his output is often poorly organized. Although Kevin is good in math, he has difficulty with word problems. In addition to these problems with his schoolwork, Kevin often appears to be lost among his fellow students. He hangs behind the others when they go out to play and often eats by himself at lunch. Mrs. Ross would like to help Kevin, but she's not sure what is wrong. Is he immature? Should he be referred for special education? Could there be some medical reason for Kevin's problems? We're going to look now at this brief definition, and then we're going to reference that case study again and see if we could connect anything to a possible speech, language, or communication deficit. So first of all, we're just going to go over these definitions. Speech. Like in my title, a speech and language pathologist. This gets confusing for people because speech and language are not the same thing. So the best way that I remember when I was first learning this stuff to remember it is speech is how you say something and your language is what you are saying. So the speech again is how you say it. It's a neuromuscular act of producing sounds that are used in languages. It's a physiological act in which the muscles involved in speech production are coordinated by the brain to actually produce the sounds of language. We're going to get a little bit more into this in a few chapters, looking at more of the anatomy and physiology of how we speak. But when I was mentioning Mason in my introduction lecture, this is what he had a problem with. He had a problem with speech. His parts of his brain weren't firing, and so he could not physically produce speech. So speech, again, is how you say it. Language, again, differentiated from speech, is what you say. So it's a rule-governed symbol system for communicating meaning through a shared code of arbitrary symbols. So again, this is very broad because we can't say it's an alphabet because or it's letters because not everybody uses letters. I guess you can't say an alphabet, but think of like Arabic or Chinese, like those symbols. It's very different. We don't all use the same kind of symbol system, but the language you learn The language you're taught that's innate, your first language, is rule governed no matter what it is. And there's symbols that represent it. And what it means to have shared code is just to mean we all understand. Um, those who speak the same language understand the same foundational code, how it works. Then the other part of language is recognizing that there's receptive areas of language and expressive. So we say there are 4 areas of language. 2 fall in receptive and 2 fall in expressive. So even though we're not together, I'm going to give you examples of the 2 areas of receptive language. And then I'm going to pause and see if you could figure out the other 2 areas of expressive language. So 2 areas of receptive language would be auditory, so in other words, understanding spoken language, and then reading, understanding written language. So auditory and reading, auditory comprehension and reading comprehension, those are areas of language, receptive language. So what could the areas of expressive language possibly be? If we think about the area of receptive language being what we hear, we could think about its counterpart in expressive language as what we say. Maybe we're going to just keep it in the head, right? What we hear in our ears or what we say with our mouth. Hearing, receptive, expressive is speaking. The same with the other area of receptive language, reading. If you're looking at its counterpart, it would be writing expressively. So, a way to get language out is through speaking or writing. And a way to receive language is through hearing it or reading it. There are different features of language. A language instinct has shared code and arbitrary symbols. I kind of went over that. I do want to pause here on this dialects. It mentions this in this chapter. There is definitely a difference in dialects, but those would not be considered a language disorder. And when we talk about dialects or accents, that's an area when we're doing a language and speech eval we have to consider, and you actually have to put that you've considered, is this just a dialectal regional difference in their language and their spoken and written communication, or is this an actual language disorder, a disability? And so it's really important that we know that, because even in different parts of of America, that's different. I'm from Kansas, but when I got married, we moved to Minnesota for my husband's job. And when we were there and I was doing my evaluations, people told me I was doing them wrong because they said, well, that's not how we say things here, right? Like they thought I said the word wagon weird, and I can't even remember, I think they say wagon. And so they told me, you scored his articulation test incorrectly. He said it wrong. And I'm thinking, no, I think that's just a dialectal difference. But, Kansas to Minnesota isn't that far. But even there, it can be an area of confusion. And so for you in your classroom, when you're going to get a mixture of kids from a mixture of places, as you're looking at their language, you're going to be considering, is this dialectal or cultural, or is this really an area of concern? Then we come to this broader category of communication. And communication and language are not necessarily the same thing. And that's confusing. Communication, in order to effectively communicate, there's actually about 4 elements to that. You have to have the sender of the message, you have to have somebody receiving the message, you have to have a shared intention of communicating to begin with. You have to both kind of be interested, and you have to have a shared means. You have to have a shared language to communicate. So, actual communication is a process that involves an exchange, okay? And that's where it differentiates from language, because for a act to actually occur. Something has to be exchanged: information, ideas, needs, or desires, okay, in the main areas there. So you can use your language and not be communicating. For example, when you journal, if you've ever journaled, um, that isn't like to share intent necessarily, usually with anyone. Like if you're just genuinely journaling your own thoughts for yourself, you're using language, but you're not sharing any information with anyone, right? It's not a process of exchanging information. So, again, just think about there's a sender, a receiver, there's that shared intention to communicate about something, and a shared means of communication. This is a nice figure in your book, figure 1.1. But again, just reiterating that point, this first box showing everything you need. And then saying here, if you're missing one, maybe you have the same means. So that would mean you have the same language, but you don't have the same intent, then it's probably a failed communication. An easier one to understand that with is the bottom one where you have a shared intent lacking. So you have the shared means in this instance. Um, so you have the you know what? I messed that up. I was reading the top. Okay, stick with me. Stick with me. I- If you have a shared means lacking, that means that you don't have the same language. A good example of that would be, so that's B again, sorry. That would be, um, we both want to communicate. We have this topic we want to communicate about, but they only speak sign language, and I don't know sign language. And they're deaf, and they're not a good lip reader, and so we don't have a shared means to actually communicate. We want to, but we can't. Sorry. The last one there, C, shared intent lacking, would mean that you do speak the same language. Maybe you're both hearing adults, and so you have the same language to use, but you don't have the shared intent. And a good example of this would be a person that has like a social communication deficit. And that is a large area of deficit for many individuals with autism spectrum. So this would be like a child with autism typically has a hard time talking about something that isn't of high interest to them. So even though you guys speak the same language, maybe you're both English language users, and you're trying to talk to them about something, your favorite TV show, but they only want to talk about trains, there's not going to be actual genuine communication there because they don't have the shared intent. Like they just don't um, care about it to put in energy into understanding and kind of communicating back and forth. So I hope I didn't confuse you in my attempts to do that. But looking at those headings again, you need the intent, the means, the sender, and the receiver. This is interesting. This is a video of them having taught this gorilla some language, if you will, and that when they did certain things, the gorilla would respond a certain way. So they were communicating for sure, but were they using language? Um, the way that this Microsoft Stream works is that I can't play as I'm recording, I can't play this, but I will put this in a YouTube playlist where you could go back and see this video if you would like to. All right, moving into language disorders. This is a definition from the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA, and that's kind of the main leader in this area. That's who speech pathologists and audiologists are certified through. And so they say that the language disorder includes both comprehension of language and language production. Again, so receptive language and expressive language. A language disorder can be identified in either spoken or written language. And a language disorder can occur in one or more aspects of language. So we know that somebody might have both a expressive and receptive language disorder or one or the other.